Over more than 2 decades, Frank Lampard built a career that very few midfielders in football history could ever touch, becoming the greatest icon of Chelsea FC, with over 200 goals, the all-time leading scorer record for the club, an almost unimaginable achievement for a midfielder. He was the heart of the team that dominated English football in the modern era, winning 3 Premier League titles, 4 FA Cups, 2 League Cups, and the pinnacle being the UEFA Champions League in 2012, the moment he not only lifted the trophy but also etched his name into European football history. Alongside the UEFA Europa League title, multiple inclusions in the Premier League Team of the Year, and finishing second in the Ballon d'Or race in 2005, a rare position for an English midfielder in the era of attacking superstars. He was also a cornerstone for the England national team with over 100 caps, participating in multiple World Cups and Euros, and known as one of the most complete midfielders, scoring, assisting, leading, and maintaining peak performance for well over a decade, a career that any player would dream of but very few achieve. But behind all those perfect numbers was a battle no one saw. A place where Lampard was never allowed to believe he was good enough, where every goal was not joy but only temporary relief from the fear of being proven unworthy. He grew up under skeptical eyes, labeled a nepo baby from his earliest days at West Ham United, and even after proving himself time and time again, that need to prove never left him. Then came the most painful moment, when his mother passed away in 2008. The one person who always believed in him, unconditionally shattering his inner world. Yet, instead of stopping, he kept playing, kept scoring, kept running non-stop as if stopping would make everything collapse. Lampard's willpower was not loud arrogance, but silent endurance. A man who never allowed himself to fall in front of the world, even when inside he fought every day just to keep himself from breaking apart. If the story of Frank Lampard makes you think, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts, where untold hidden angles will gradually be revealed. Born into a family where football was not just a sport, but almost a pre-written destiny, Frank Lampard never truly had the chance to be a normal child, because from the moment the name Lampard was mentioned, it carried an enormous shadow he could not escape. His father, Frank Lampard Sr., was a respected name in English football, a man who understood the harshness of the pitch, and also understood that his son would step into an unforgiving world where talent alone was not enough, where every mistake was magnified, and where family reputation could become a double-edged sword opening doors, while placing an invisible pressure on shoulders that no child should have to bear. Around him were also big football figures like Harry Redknapp, who was not only an uncle, but part of the system that shaped his career path. And that very fact made the world see Lampard not as an individual, but as a product, created from connections, from legacy, from things others didn't have, an assessment that seemed like an advantage, but was actually a suspended sentence from before he could prove anything. People didn't ask who he wanted to become. They just assumed what he would become, and in the silence of childhood, Lampard gradually understood that his life would not be measured by effort, but by the prejudices he had to break every single day. The pressure didn't come as a heavy blow, but seeped into the smallest moments of life, in his father's expectant gaze, in training sessions where mistakes were not tolerated, in offhand comments that cut deep into a boy's mind that he was not allowed to be weak, not allowed to be slower, not allowed to fail. Other kids played football for joy, for laughter, for the feeling of freedom when running on the pitch. But for Lampard, football very early became a duty, a constant test he was never permitted to fail. Because if he failed, it wasn't just his own failure. It was the failure of the entire name he carried, and that created a silent but persistent fear, a fear that was never loud but always present, that every step he took was being watched, judged, and compared to a standard he never got to choose. People often think being born into a famous family is a gift. But for Lampard, it was like a room with no exit door, where every path was already mapped out, where he had no right to make mistakes, no right to experiment, and even no right to fail in order to learn how to get back up, because every stumble was seen as proof that he didn't deserve what he had. Before he could understand himself, the world had already defined him. Before he could dream of a future, others had already written the script for his life. And the most painful thing was not how huge the pressure was, but how early it arrived, when he was still too young to understand that a person's worth should not be decided by what they were born with, but by what they build for themselves. It was in those years that something began to form inside Lampard, not confidence, but a void, a feeling that he had to do more than others just to stand on equal ground with them, that he had to be more perfect than others, just to be considered normal, and that no matter how hard he tried, there would always be some voice somewhere reminding him that everything he achieved wasn't truly his. That was the beginning of a war no one saw, a war not fought on the pitch, but in the mind, where a boy carrying the name Lampard began learning to live with pressure, not by overcoming it, but by carrying it with him throughout his life, as an inseparable part of himself. The early years at West Ham United should have been the place where a young player began to write his own story, but for Frank Lampard, it was where he realized that his story had already been defined by others beforehand, and worse, judged before he could prove anything at all. Every time he stepped onto the pitch, he wasn't just facing opponents, but also facing skeptical eyes from the very people who were supposed to support him. The boos ringing out from the stands, not because he made mistakes, but simply because he existed there, in the shirt that many believed he didn't deserve to wear. They didn't see a young player trying to learn and grow. They only saw Lampard's son and Redknapp's nephew, a living symbol of what they called nepotism, a favoritism that in their eyes had stolen opportunities from more deserving people. And from that very moment, Lampard was no longer allowed to be an ordinary person. He became a target, became evidence, became the name that people wanted to prove wrong. The criticism didn't stop at the stands. It seeped into the locker room, into newspaper articles, into conversations he overheard by accident, where people didn't hesitate to say he was only there because of connections, that he wasn't good enough, that he had no future without the name he carried. The media made everything heavier by constantly bringing up his background as a big question mark, a doubt he had to carry every time he played, and within the team itself, even if not everyone said it out loud, Lampard could still feel the difference in how he was perceived, as if he always had to prove more than others just to stand at the same starting line. It was no longer football. It was an endless trial where he was always the defendant, and every match was another chance to defend his own existence. There were days when the pressure became so heavy he could feel it in every stride, in every touch of the ball, as if every small mistake could become proof for the world to conclude they were right about him from the start. And that very thing made him start playing, not with freedom, but with fear, not to express himself, but to avoid being proven unworthy. He began training more, staying on the pitch longer, doing everything possible to be more perfect. But the harder he tried, the more he realized the problem wasn't how well he performed, but that people had already decided what they wanted to believe about him. And when you're hated not for what you do, but for what you represent, then no victory is ever truly enough to change that right away. It was during that period that a quiet but profound change began to take place inside Lampard. Not an explosion of talent, but the formation of an obsession, an extreme need to prove himself, a belief that if he worked harder than everyone else, if he never stopped, if he never allowed himself a mistake, then maybe one day the booze would disappear, the skeptical looks would soften, and he would be seen as a real player rather than a pre-placed name in the lineup. But what he didn't realize at the time was that this war had no clear ending, because every time he got closer to acceptance, the standards were raised higher, The expectations became harsher, and the fear of judgment came back stronger than before. West Ham should have been the starting point, but for Lampard, it became the place where he learned the most painful lesson of his life, that some battles cannot be won with goals or titles, that some prejudices cannot be broken by talent alone, and that sometimes the biggest fight isn't against others, but against the feeling they planted inside you, the feeling that you're not enough, that you don't deserve it, that you have to do more than everyone else just to be considered equal. And from then on, a boy who once just wanted to play football began turning into a man carrying an invisible burden, a man who no longer played for joy, but for a single goal: to prove the world wrong about him, even if the price was the very peace of his own soul. What began at West Ham United didn't stop at doubt or booze, but gradually turned into a deep sense of isolation that Frank Lampard couldn't name. A state where he was present among the group, but never truly belonged to it, like someone standing in the middle of the locker room, but always feeling like he was outside the door. Teammates might pass him the ball, might talk to him, but somewhere there was still an invisible distance. Something no one said out loud, but everyone felt that he wasn't like them, that his path wasn't like theirs, and therefore he wasn't fully trusted like the others, wasn't fully seen as a natural part of the team. That feeling wasn't loud, wasn't explosive, but quiet and persistent, like a small crack that kept spreading wider, making every run on the pitch heavier, every touch of the ball carrying an invisible pressure he couldn't shake off. Playing under those circumstances was no longer a game, but became a constant test, where every action was scrutinized, every mistake was magnified, and every moment of hesitation could become evidence to reinforce the doubts that people had already prepared for him long before. Lampard began to feel clearly that he didn't have the right to make mistakes like others did, that a bad pass from him wasn't just a technical error, but a confirmation in others' eyes that he didn't deserve to be there. And that very thing made him step into every match, not with the freedom of a player, but with the tension of someone on trial, where he had to control every movement, every decision, every breath, as if just one moment of lost focus would make everything collapse instantly. The fear of failing began to sink deep into the way he played football, not the normal fear of a young player, but an existential fear. A fear that every mistake would cost him not just his position, but his very right to stand on the pitch, and worse, his only chance to prove he wasn't a product of favoritism. He started thinking more before acting, weighing more before every touch, and in that process, a natural part of himself gradually got suffocated, because he no longer played on instinct, but played out of fear, out of pressure, out of the invisible scrutiny he felt everywhere. From the stands, from the media, from the very eyes of those around him. But instead of collapsing, Lampard began building something else to protect himself. Not confidence, but a shell, an image he gradually perfected over time, colder, quieter, more disciplined, as if he were trying to turn himself into an emotionless machine, a person unaffected by what happened around him, a person who could stand firm amid criticism without showing any sign of weakness. He learned to stay silent when doubted, learned to work harder instead of reacting, learned to let actions speak instead of words, and day by day that shell grew thicker, stronger, making the world start to see a different Lampard. Calm, resolute, unshaken, but no one knew that behind that control was constant tension, a pressure that never disappeared, a battle he couldn't stop even for a single moment. Perhaps the most painful thing wasn't the isolation itself, but having to accept it as part of life, having to learn to exist within it instead of finding a way out, because Lampard gradually understood that he couldn't change how the world saw him right away, but he could change how he responded. And from that, a new person began to form, not the boy who just wanted to play football, but a man learning to endure, learning to control, learning to stand firm in silence. But what was the price of that maturity? It was the loss of freedom, the feeling of always having to maintain an image he could never let go of, carrying a fear no one saw but always present. And when Lampard stepped onto the pitch, amid tens of thousands of people, amid the cheers and bright lights, perhaps no one realized that he wasn't just a player competing, but a human being trying not to let himself collapse right in front of the whole world. That one day, amid all the accumulated pressure and endless isolation at West Ham United, Frank Lampard faced a decision that he probably understood would define the rest of his life: to leave, not because he had won, but because he could no longer exist in a place where every step was doubted, where his past and his name were always bigger than what he could do on the pitch. That decision didn't come with the excitement of a new beginning, but felt like a quiet escape, a final effort to find a place where he could be seen as a real player, not a shadow of his family or a product of connections. And when he moved to Chelsea FC, the outside world might have seen a career step forward. But for Lampard, it was an all-in gamble, a do-or-die chance he couldn't afford to fail. Chelsea at that time wasn't a place for the weak, not a place for players who needed time to adapt or rediscover themselves, but an environment where competition was so brutal that one misstep could get you replaced instantly. And that meant Lampard didn't just have to prove himself again, he had to do it at a higher level, under bigger skeptical eyes, in a system that demanded near absolute perfection. If at West Ham he was doubted because of his background, at Chelsea he would be judged solely on one standard: was he good enough to survive here or not? And that shift, though it seemed fairer, brought an even more terrifying pressure. Because now there was no excuse left if he failed, no story to explain it away, only results cold and unforgiving. The early days at Chelsea weren't days of hope, but days of extreme tension, where every training session felt like a test, every match like a trial, and every mistake like a verdict that could end everything before it truly began. Lampard understood he had no right to fail, no right to need time, no right to adapt slowly like others, because he carried too much doubt from the past, and if he didn't prove himself immediately, everything would collapse faster than it was built. And perhaps that's exactly why he started doing the only thing he knew: working harder than anyone else, running more, training longer, pushing himself to limits others might never reach, as if he were trying to create a perfect version of himself just to survive in this environment. But the most painful thing wasn't the external pressure. It was carrying everything that had haunted him from West Ham to Chelsea. Carrying the fear of failing. Carrying the feeling of not belonging. Carrying the doubt that everything he had was only temporary and could be taken away at any moment. He started over, but not with an empty mind, but with a heavier burden, bigger expectations, greater fear, and that made every step forward twice as hard, because he didn't just have to overcome new challenges, he also had to fight old wounds that had never healed. There were players who moved to a big club with dreams, with ambition, with the belief that they would shine, but for Lampard, Chelsea wasn't a dream, it was a place to survive. A place where he had to prove he wasn't a mistake, that he didn't exist just because of his name, that he deserved every minute on the pitch. And that very thing turned his journey there not into a story of explosive talent, but into a prolonged war where every success came at the cost of exhaustion, where every step forward was built on a foundation of fear, and where he never truly felt he had arrived. Because deep down there was always a voice reminding him that it could all disappear at any moment. And so, when the world began to see a different Lampard, stronger, more decisive, more effective, they thought he had found himself, that he had overcome what once held him back. But the truth was far more complicated, because what changed wasn't the fear itself, but the way he lived with it, not the pressure disappearing, but him learning to carry it without letting it break him. And in that process, he entered a new phase of his life, a phase where he began winning on the pitch, But the inner battle continued, quietly, relentlessly, and perhaps more brutally than ever. Then, everything started to change, at least on the surface, as Frank Lampard gradually turned himself into an indispensable part of Chelsea FC. Goals came more frequently, smart movements began to get noticed, and his name no longer appeared only in debates about background or connections, but started being mentioned as a real player, a midfielder capable of making a difference, someone who could change the course of a match with one decisive moment. Step by step, he cemented his place in the lineup, not through instant explosion, but through cold consistency, through repeated performances with near-mechanical precision, as if he were building a fortress from his own non-stop efforts. And to the outside world, that was the image of a rise, a success story, proof that talent and hard work were finally rewarded. But inside, the story was completely different, because every goal didn't bring the joy people imagined, but only a fleeting sense of relief, as if he had just temporarily escaped a suspended sentence hanging over his head, as if he had gained one more piece of evidence to delay the day the world could turn back and say they were right about him from the start. He scored, and instead of celebrating fully, a part of him started thinking about the next match, the next touch, the next mistake that could happen, and that made success a state that was never complete, something always accompanied by a simmering worry that it wouldn't last, that it was only temporary, that at any moment everything could go back to how it was before. Recognition began to arrive, from teammates, from coaches, from the media. But even when praise appeared, it wasn't enough to erase the doubts that had sunk deep into his mind from those earlier years, because when you've lived too long with the feeling of having to prove yourself, you don't easily believe you've truly done it. Lampard started being called one of the best midfielders, started being seen as a key factor in the team's success, but somewhere deep down he still felt like he was playing a role, as if everything he was doing was just a shell that would sooner or later be peeled away. And that very thing turned every compliment not into confidence, but into added pressure, because now he didn't just have to prove he deserved it. He had to maintain the image others were starting to believe in. Gradually, a loop formed, a loop he couldn't escape. Prove, get recognized, doubt, prove again, repeating endlessly like a machine with no off switch. And in that loop, joy gradually vanished, replaced by obsession, by the need to maintain, to be perfect, to keep pushing forward, because any pause could be seen as decline, as a sign he didn't truly deserve what he'd achieved. He started playing not to enjoy, but to control, not to create, but to ensure he made no mistakes. And in that process, a part of his humanity was slowly traded away, replaced by a more efficient, stronger version, but also more distant, colder, and far more exhausted. Perhaps what made this journey so painful wasn't that Lampard had to work harder than others, but that he never allowed himself to fully feel what he had achieved, never allowed himself to stop and say, "This is enough." Because in his world, enough didn't exist, only not enough, and have to do more. Only new goals, higher standards, bigger pressures. And that turned success into a burden rather than a reward, something he had to carry instead of enjoy. And when people looked at Lampard and saw a player becoming more complete, more effective, more legendary, they believed he was getting closer to wholeness, that he was becoming the best version of himself. But they didn't see that the further he went, the further he drifted from peace, that every step forward came with a price, that behind that stability was a tension that never disappeared, a fear always present, and a question he could never answer. If one day he stopped scoring, stopped making a difference, stopped proving anything, who would he still be in the eyes of the world? And more importantly, who would he still be in his own eyes? And it was in that endless loop that what started as a vague feeling gradually grew into a clear, persistent, inescapable war inside Frank Lampard's mind. A war no one could see, no one could intervene in, and with no whistle to end it. People called it imposter syndrome. But for Lampard, it wasn't a psychological concept, it was a vivid reality. A voice always whispering that everything he achieved was only temporary, that one day the world would realize he didn't truly deserve the place he stood in, that all his success was just a string of lucky moments stretched too long, and the scariest part wasn't what others said, but that he began to believe that voice himself, began to doubt himself even when no one else doubted him anymore. From then on, his double life became clearer than ever, almost splitting into two parallel existences that never met. On one side, the image the world saw, a Chelsea FC legend, a relentlessly scoring midfielder, a cool-headed and reliable leader who always appeared at the right time, did the right thing, and rarely made mistakes. On the other side, the real person, the man who always wondered if he truly belonged there, who never felt enough despite achieving things others could only dream of, who lived with a simmering fear that it was all just a dream that would sooner or later fade away. Those two lives weren't just different, they were completely opposite, and what made it so draining was having to maintain both at the same time, keeping the perfect outer image while inside he was constantly pulled down by never-ending doubts. Every time he stepped onto the pitch, Lampard didn't just carry the responsibility of a player, but also carried a question that never had a clear answer. Do I really deserve this? It wasn't a passing thought, but a question that repeated over and over in every training session, in every match, in every moment he stood alone. And that very question shaped the way he lived, the way he played football, the way he saw himself. Because if the answer was no, then everything he had would become fragile, breakable, and could collapse at any moment. So he never allowed himself to believe the answer was yes. He always kept himself in a state of having to prove, having to do more, having to be better, because that was the only way to keep that fear from becoming reality. The pressure from then on no longer came from opponents, no longer from the stands or the media, but from himself, from the standards he set for himself, from the expectations he never lowered, from the fear he never confronted directly. He could score goals, win matches, receive recognition from the whole world, but none of that was enough to silence the inner voice, because that voice didn't care about reality. It only cared about fear, about the possibility of failure, about the scenario where he lost everything he had built. And so, every success only made him work harder. Every compliment only made him set higher standards. Every victory only made him more afraid of having to sustain it. And in a world like that, rest became something almost impossible, not just physically but mentally, because even when his body could stop, his mind kept running, kept analyzing, kept preparing, kept worrying about what could happen. There were nights when he couldn't sleep fully. Not because of physical pain, but because of thoughts that spun non-stop, failure scenarios drawn out in his head, situations where he didn't play well, didn't meet expectations, and all of that created a prolonged state of tension, an immeasurable exhaustion, because it didn't come from muscles, but from the mind, from living in a war no one saw but was always present. Perhaps what made this battle so brutal wasn't that it was too big, but that it never ended. There was no moment when Lampard could say, "It's done." No day when he could fully relax without feeling like he was falling behind. No victory big enough to make him believe he had truly overcome everything. Because in his world, everything could always change, everything could always collapse, and so he had to always be ready, always on alert, always in a state of fighting, even when no one was attacking him anymore. And when people looked at Lampard and saw a durable player, someone who never stopped, an icon of professionalism and discipline, they didn't know that behind all of it was a war with no audience, a war he could never fully win, only continue fighting, continue moving forward, continue upholding the image the world believed in, while inside he was still trying to answer a simple but haunting question: do I really deserve all of this? Or am I just trying to hold on to it as long as possible before everything disappears? Precisely because that war never stopped. Frank Lampard gradually turned his life into a series of extremely disciplined habits, where every day wasn't an opportunity to enjoy football, but an obligation to fulfill. A test to pass. A race he couldn't afford to slow down even one step. He arrived at training earlier than everyone else, left later than everyone else, repeated drills others had long finished, not because he loved the grind, but because he believed that if he did more, if he sacrificed more, if he never stopped progressing, then perhaps he would have enough evidence to convince the world, and more importantly, to convince himself that he truly deserved the place he held. But deep down, it wasn't confidence, it was fear. A fear that if he stopped even for a moment, everything would collapse as quickly as it had once been doubted from the beginning. There were players who relied on natural talent, on instinct, on creativity to shine, but Lampard understood that his path wasn't like that he wasn't allowed to believe he was good enough in a natural way. And so he chose a different path, a longer, harder, lonelier one. The path of repetition, of preparation, of turning everything into a system he could control, every shot practiced hundreds of times, every movement calculated in advance, every match analyzed down to the smallest detail, as if he were trying to eliminate every random element from the game, because for him, a mistake wasn't part of football. It was a threat. Something that could destroy everything he had built. And that very thing made him different, not because he was more talented, but because he never allowed himself to rely on talent without matching preparation. But the paradox was that the more successful he became, the greater the fear inside him grew. Not smaller as people might think, because every step forward brought new expectations. Every title set a higher standard, and every recognition made him feel more pressure to maintain it, to prove it wasn't just a lucky moment. He scored more goals, performed more consistently, became one of the best midfielders. But instead of feeling confident, he worried more about the day when things might no longer work as before, when there would be a match where he didn't make a difference, a period where he was no longer at his peak. And then all the doubts would return, stronger, more ruthless, like a confirmation that he had never truly belonged here. And so he kept running, not just on the pitch, but in his entire life, running from doubt, from the feeling of not being enough, from the version of himself he feared would be exposed if he stopped. Opponents on the field could change, could be stronger or weaker, but Lampard's real opponent was always himself, the inner voice, the standards he never lowered, the fear he never confronted directly, and that made his battle uneven because he couldn't defeat himself once and be done. He had to do it every day, every training session, every match, repeating endlessly without rest. Gradually, football was no longer just a career, but became a refuge, a space he could control, where everything was decided by effort, by discipline, by what he could do, not by what others thought of him. On the pitch, he knew what he had to do, knew where to run, how to shoot, how to react, and that clarity gave him a sense of safety he couldn't find anywhere else. Because off the pitch, the world became more vague, more unpredictable, and full of judgments he couldn't control. So he clung to football like an anchor, like a way to keep himself from being swept away by his inner thoughts, like a way to turn fear into action, pressure into motivation, doubt into fuel to keep moving forward. But what was the price of that stability? It was never truly leaving the battle. It was that even when everything was going well, he still couldn't relax, still couldn't enjoy, still couldn't believe he had done enough. He became a near perfectly functioning machine. But precisely because of that, he grew further from normal feelings, from lightness, from the pure joy of football he might once have had as a boy. Before the name Lampard became a burden, before every run carried a meaning bigger than itself, and when people saw him constantly moving on the pitch, constantly appearing at the right moment, constantly making a difference, They called it resilience, professionalism, the quality of a legend, but they didn't know that behind every run was an effort to escape, not from opponents, but from the doubts inside, from the fear he could never put down. And perhaps what makes Lampard's story so special isn't how far he ran, but that he never truly stopped, because he didn't dare. But then there were pains that even iron discipline couldn't control. Moments when every layer Frank Lampard had painstakingly built over years suddenly became so fragile that just a light touch was enough to shatter it all. And that event came in 2008, when his mother, the woman who always stood behind him, who quietly believed in him even when the whole world doubted, passed away. It wasn't just the loss of a loved one, but the departure of the only person who never questioned his worth, the only one who didn't need him to prove anything, the only one who saw the real person behind all the titles, pressures, and expectations. And when she left, a very deep part inside Lampard vanished with her, leaving a void that no victory, no goal, no recognition could ever fill. In the days that followed, the world kept going as usual. The fixture list continued, matches were still played, and Lampard, as he always did, kept stepping onto the pitch, kept playing, kept upholding the image everyone expected, but inside everything had changed completely. The pain didn't explode into tears right away, but quietly spread, seeping into every thought, every moment, every silence he could no longer fill with work or focus. And for the first time in his life, he couldn't control what was happening inside him, couldn't neatly turn the pain into motivation like before, couldn't run away from it with training sessions or matches. Then that moment came, a moment that many would later remember as an iconic image. But for Lampard, it wasn't a symbol. It was an inevitable collapse. He scored a goal, a familiar finish, a moment that should have been celebrated like so many before. But instead of raising his arms, instead of running toward the stands, he stopped. His eyes drifted away for a brief second that said everything, and then the tears began to fall. Not controlled tears, not a symbolic gesture, but a natural reaction, a breaking open he had suppressed for too long. In the middle of the noisy stadium, amid tens of thousands of people, he stood there, no longer a player, no longer a legend, but just a son who had just lost the most important person in his life. That moment marked the first time Lampard couldn't hold his shell together, couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, couldn't turn emotion into something controllable and usable. And because of that, it became special, not because it was rare, but because it was so real it couldn't be hidden. Everything he had built to protect himself, the coldness, the discipline, the control suddenly became meaningless in the face of grief. And for the first time he had to confront a truth he had always tried to avoid, that some things in life can't be fixed by effort, can't be overcome by willpower, can't be won by discipline. His mother's passing didn't just take away a loved one. It took away the only anchor Lampard could turn to when everything became too much to bear. And when that anchor disappeared, the entire structure he relied on to survive began to shake. He kept playing football, kept scoring, kept being a key part of the team, but something had changed forever. A crack appeared in the way he saw the world, in the way he saw himself, in the way he faced pressure and fear, because now there was no one left to prove himself to, no one left to seek unconditional recognition from, and that made every effort suddenly feel emptier than ever. Perhaps what made this pain so profound wasn't just the loss, but the realization that even though he had spent his whole life becoming strong, never falling, controlling everything around him, there were still things completely out of his reach, things he couldn't change, couldn't prepare for, couldn't handle with any skill he had learned on the pitch. And that very thing plunged him into a state he had never experienced before, a state where he didn't know what to do, didn't know how to react, didn't know how to keep going, because every tool he had ever relied on became useless against this pain. From then on, a new phase began. Not a complete collapse, but a deep internal fracture, a wound that didn't bleed but never healed, a void he carried with him in every step, in every match, in every moment of life. He was still the Lampard the world knew, still scoring, still fighting, still maintaining the perfect image. But inside, a part had changed forever. A part no longer protected, no longer fully hidden, a part that made his inner battle more complex, deeper, and more painful than ever. And if before he ran to prove himself, to escape doubt, to hold his position, then from that moment he began running for a different reason. A reason he couldn't clearly name, but strong enough to keep him moving forward, to avoid stopping and facing the void his mother's death had left, to avoid sitting still and feeling the pain fully, to keep existing in a world he was used to controlling even when the most important part of it was gone forever. After the moment his world collapsed, Frank Lampard's life didn't stop, didn't slow down, and didn't give him any chance to truly face his pain, because football, the thing that had become the center of everything, kept running at an unforgiving pace. The fixture list didn't care about loss, the pitch didn't allow weakness, and the lights never went out just because a heart was breaking. Just a few days after his mother passed away, he stepped back onto the field, put on the familiar shirt again, ran again, battled again, played as if nothing had happened, as if the pain was something he could temporarily set aside. And in the eyes of the world there was an image of strength, of professionalism, of a man who never fell. But inside it wasn't strength, it was suppression. A way of surviving that he had no other choice but to follow. Lampard didn't know how to grieve in the normal sense, didn't know how to stop, didn't know how to allow himself to be weak, because he had spent his whole life learning to control, to keep everything in check, to turn emotions into something manageable, usable, hideable, and that very thing made him unable to let himself break open again like that moment on the pitch, unable to let the pain take him over completely, unable to sit down and accept that some losses couldn't be overcome by effort or willpower. Instead, he kept doing the only thing he knew: keep moving forward, keep playing, keep working, as if by not stopping the pain wouldn't catch up to him. But the pain didn't disappear, it just changed shape, from a violent shock into a simmering undercurrent that seeped into every moment of life, into the silences between matches, into the nights when he could no longer distract himself with work, into the moments when he realized there was no one left to listen to him unconditionally. He didn't cry as much as people might imagine, didn't collapse in obvious ways, but that didn't mean he wasn't hurting it, only meant he carried that pain in a different way, quieter, more hidden, but also much heavier, because it was never fully released, never clearly named, never allowed to exist completely. Gradually, a distance began to form between Lampard and his own emotions, not because he had no feelings, but because he no longer knew what to do with them, no longer knew how to process them naturally, since everything was filtered through the lens of control, of discipline, of the need to keep functioning. He could understand that he was sad, could recognize that he was grieving, but couldn't truly feel it the way a normal person could. Because if he allowed that to happen, he feared he wouldn't be able to come back, that he would lose the balance he had worked so hard to build, that he wouldn't be strong enough to continue the battle he had grown so used to over the years. And so he chose to keep going, not because he had overcome it, but because he never truly stopped to face it. He kept scoring, kept playing the role of a man unaffected by what happened off the pitch, and the world kept believing in that image, kept honoring him as a symbol of resilience, of unyielding will. But no one knew that behind that resilience was a gradual disconnection, a growing void between the person he showed and the person he really was, a gap that made him drift further and further from himself. Perhaps the most painful thing wasn't that Lampard didn't cry, but that he no longer knew when he should cry, no longer knew the line between enduring and losing himself, no longer knew how to distinguish between being strong and being emotionally numb. He kept living, kept moving forward, kept fighting. But a part inside him had stopped at that moment. At the moment his world collapsed, and from then on everything he did, every step he took, carried a trace of the loss he had never truly healed. A pain that no longer exploded, but also never disappeared, just quietly existed as an inseparable part of the person he had become. And when a person has become too accustomed to suppressing emotions, too accustomed to setting everything aside to keep moving forward, then personal relationships, things that demand sincerity, openness, and real presence, become more fragile than ever. And for Frank Lampard, love wasn't a place to escape pressure, but sometimes became another place where he felt he couldn't measure up enough. His relationship with the Lenrivas once gave him a rare sense of peace, a space where he could temporarily step away from the expectations of the pitch. But even in those moments, football was always present. Not as a choice, but as a duty he couldn't refuse, something that took up all his time, energy, and mind, making balance between career and personal life an almost impossible task. The pressure didn't just come from matches or training sessions, it came from the way he saw himself, from the need to be perfect in every aspect, from the fear that if he let go anywhere, everything would start to collapse, and that made him unable to truly be present in relationships, unable to give himself fully to someone else, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. He could be next to the person he loved, but his mind was still on the training ground, still analyzing the next match, still preparing for upcoming challenges, and gradually that distance became clearer. Not a physical distance, but an emotional one. Something hard to notice at first, but growing bigger over time. The conflicts didn't have to be loud, didn't have to explode into big arguments. Sometimes they were just moments of silence, absences, times when full sharing wasn't possible, feelings that the other person wasn't really there even though they were sitting right next to him. And those small things, accumulating over time, gradually cracked a relationship that should have been a safe refuge. Lampard wasn't someone who didn't love, but he was someone who didn't know how to put love before what he had long considered his absolute priority. And in his world where everything revolved around proving, maintaining, relentlessly moving forward, love became something hard to hold on to, not because it was weak, but because he didn't have enough space to keep it. The breakup, when it came, wasn't just the end of a relationship, but a painful reminder that some things in life can't be controlled by discipline or effort, that not everything can be fixed by doing more or trying harder. And for Lampard, that was a failure in a way he rarely had to face because it couldn't be measured by numbers, couldn't be repaired by a better match, couldn't be erased by a goal. But as always, he didn't stop to face it fully, didn't allow himself to sink into the emotions too long, but kept moving forward, kept upholding the image, kept living at the pace he was used to, as if that was the only way not to be swept away by what he couldn't control. And then, over time, something changed. Not the pressure disappearing, not the pain fully healed, but the way he began to see life off the pitch. When he met Christine Lampard, someone who didn't belong to the football world in the way he was accustomed to. Someone who brought a different perspective, a different rhythm of life, a way of existing not completely dominated by achievements or judgment. This relationship wasn't an emotional explosion, but a gradual stability, a process where he learned to slow down, to be present, to open up little by little, even though that wasn't easy at all for someone so used to control and suppression. Family, from then on, became something Lampard started to see differently. Not as a secondary part of life, but as an anchor he had never truly had. A place where he didn't need to prove, didn't need to be perfect, didn't need to uphold the image the world expected, and even though this healing came late, even though it couldn't erase what had happened before, it still gave him something he had lacked for so long, the feeling of being accepted without conditions, a feeling he had only had from his mother before, and lost too soon. But even when he found that stability, Lampard's story didn't become a perfect one, because what he had been through didn't easily disappear. The habits, the fears, the ways he had learned to survive were still there, and he still had to learn how to balance the person he had become with the person he was trying to become, between life on the pitch and life off it, between continuing to fight and learning to let go. And perhaps what makes this journey meaningful isn't that he found a complete ending, but that he finally began to allow himself to live as a human being, not just as a player. Even though it came later than he ever thought, and even when things seemed to start settling more, when life off the pitch gradually had an anchor, when Frank Lampard was no longer completely lost in emotional voids like before, then on the pitch he entered a phase that for any player would be considered the absolute peak. But for him it was another paradox, a peak that didn't bring a complete sense of victory. He became a legend of Chelsea FC, breaking every limit a midfielder could reach, scoring more than 200 goals, becoming the club's all-time leading scorer, winning every major and minor title from the Premier League and FA Cup to the UEFA Champions League, becoming the leader, the icon, and the embodiment of a brilliantly successful era. A career that from the outside looked almost perfect with no flaws to find. But in Lampard's world, where every success came with a question, where every victory was followed by doubt, that peak wasn't an ending, but a new starting point for comparisons, evaluations, questions he could never fully escape. And the name that always appeared alongside him, almost inseparable, was Steven Gerrard, another player, another icon, another person with a different story, but always placed next to Lampard as an endless comparison. The media, fans, experts all wanted to answer what seemed like a simple but incredibly complex question: who was better? And that very question, repeating year after year through every tournament, every individual award, became an inseparable part of Lampard's career. Something he couldn't control, couldn't avoid, and couldn't end. No matter how many goals he scored, how many titles he won, how many records he broke, there was always a comparison running parallel like a shadow he couldn't shake off. And what made it so uncomfortable wasn't being underrated, but never being seen completely independently, never existing as a unique version of himself, without being placed next to someone else. There were times when Lampard was recognized, praised, seen as one of the best midfielders in the world. But even then, the question didn't disappear. It still lingered somewhere, like a reminder that no matter how much he had achieved, there was still a debate he couldn't decisively win. And for someone who had spent his whole life proving himself, seeking recognition, escaping doubts, never having a clear answer, never having a moment when everyone agreed he was the best, became a quiet burden, something not big enough to destroy him, but persistent enough to make him never feel completely enough. The irony is that Lampard wasn't a player lacking in achievements, not someone without proof to validate his worth. On the contrary, he had everything a footballer could dream of, but in his inner world, those proofs were never strong enough to completely silence the inner voice, the voice that always asked, if I'm really the best, why is there still doubt? If I've done enough, why do I still have to be compared? And those very questions made every success, no matter how great, unable to bring a complete sense of fulfillment, an absolute affirmation he had sought his entire life. Perhaps for others, being compared to a great player like Gerrard was an honor, a sign they had reached a special level. But for Lampard, it was a reminder that his journey of proving himself had never truly ended, that no matter how far he had gone, there was still some standard he hadn't reached, some recognition he hadn't fully achieved, and that kept him doing what he always did: keep working, keep pushing, keep trying to be better, not to defeat others, but to quiet the doubts inside himself. But the truth Lampard gradually had to face was that some battles can't be won the way he wanted. Some questions have no definitive answers. Some comparisons will always exist, no matter what he does. And when he began to understand that, It wasn't the pain that disappeared, but the way he viewed it that changed from trying to prove himself to gain absolute recognition to accepting that perhaps that recognition would never come the way he imagined. And it was in that shift that something began to change. Not in how the world saw him, but in how he saw himself. Even though the process was slow, difficult, and full of contradictions. And so Lampard's story at the peak wasn't the story of someone who achieved everything and felt satisfied, but the story of someone who reached nearly every limit his profession allowed, yet still carried the feeling that he had never truly been the best, a feeling that didn't come from reality, but from the way he had been shaped from the years of having to prove himself, from the endless comparisons, from a journey whose destination was never as clear as he once thought. And perhaps what makes that story so heartbreaking isn't what he lacked, but that he had everything, yet never felt enough. And then, as all the comparisons gradually faded, as the debates about who was better no longer became the center of his life, a bigger, emptier truth began to emerge. The moment when Frank Lampard left the pitch, not temporarily but permanently. A decision every player knows will come, but no one is truly ready for when it arrives. For more than 2 decades, football wasn't just a career. It was his identity, the way he defined himself, the place he ran to, every time he needed to escape the doubts, the pain, the voids inside. And when all of that suddenly vanished, what remained wasn't relief, but a silence he had never had to face. No more training sessions, no more cheers, no more matches where everything was clear, where he knew what to do, where to run, how to fight. Lampard stepped into a world without a map, a world with no specific opponent to defeat, no specific goal to achieve, no familiar structure to hold on to. And it was in that absence that a question began to rise clearer than ever. If I'm no longer a player, who am I? The void after his career didn't hit immediately like a shock, but crept in gradually, like a strange feeling waking up without a training schedule, a day passing without a match to prepare for. When time, the thing that had always been scarce, suddenly became so abundant it was uncomfortable. He could fill it with other work, new roles, moving into coaching, but nothing truly replaced the feeling the pitch once gave. Nothing recreated the clarity, the focus, the certainty he had while playing. And that made him realize football wasn't just part of his life, it was what had kept everything else from collapsing. And when there was no longer a pitch to run to, no matches to distract him, Lampard, for the first time, had to face himself fully without the shell of a player, without titles to shield him, without external pressure to drown out what was happening inside. The questions he had once avoided, the emotions he had suppressed, the pains he had set aside, all slowly returned, no longer delayed, no longer hidden. And in that silence they became clearer, heavier, and harder to evade than ever. The silence that others might see as peace became for Lampard the greatest challenge, because he wasn't used to being alone with his thoughts, wasn't used to having nothing to do but feel, wasn't used to being unable to run from what was happening inside. For so many years, he had used movement as a way to survive, action to replace emotion, discipline to control what he didn't want to face. And now, with all of that gone, he was forced to learn something he had never learned: how to stop. But stopping wasn't easy, especially for someone who had built his entire life on never stopping, because when he tried, when he allowed himself not to be busy, not swept up in work, not pulled by schedules, the voids quickly filled with thoughts he had tried to avoid for years, memories of loss, of relationships that ended, of moments he never truly faced. And that made him realize his biggest battle had never been on the pitch, but always inside. It was just that before he had a place to escape it. Perhaps what made this phase so difficult wasn't that Lampard lost football, but that he lost the way he had once used to understand himself, lost the system he relied on to feel safe, and when that system was gone, he had to rebuild a new way of seeing himself. A way of existing not completely dependent on achievements, on recognition, on constantly proving himself. And that was a process with no guide, no formula, no guarantee he would get it right. And so, in that silence, in the void football left behind, Lampard wasn't just ending a career. He was beginning another journey, one difficult in a completely different way, where he no longer faced defenders, no longer ran on the pitch, but had to confront himself. The person he had become after all those years of fighting, the parts of himself he had never truly understood, and perhaps for the first time in his life, he couldn't solve the problem by doing more, running faster or trying harder, but had to learn to listen, to accept, and to exist in a world with no noise to drown out what was happening inside. And while Frank Lampard was still learning how to exist in that silence, while he still hadn't fully understood who he was, if not a player, he stepped into a new journey, not as a legend on the pitch, but as someone starting over from the beginning. This time as a coach, a role he thought his experiences would turn into an advantage, but soon realized that no matter how great the past was, it wasn't a shield protecting him from failure. He started with hope, with belief that he could transform everything he had learned into something new, but football from a different angle no longer operated the way he was familiar with. And for the first time in many years, he was no longer the one directly controlling the match, no longer the one who could change the outcome with a single touch, but had to depend on factors he couldn't fully control. When he returned to manage Chelsea FC, the place that had once been the peak of his career, everything seemed like it would be a perfect circle, a beautiful story of a legend coming back to continue his legacy. But reality was far harsher, because now he was no longer judged by what he had done in the past, but by what he was doing in the present, every match, every decision, every result. And when those results didn't meet expectations, when the team didn't achieve enough, the doubts returned, not with the gentle intensity of before, but sharper, more direct, because now he wasn't a young player trying to prove himself, but the coach of one of the biggest clubs in the world, a place with no room for long-term patience. Being sacked wasn't just a professional failure, but a blow to the very identity he was trying to rebuild. A reminder that no matter who he had once been, that didn't guarantee success in the new role, that the past couldn't be used as permanent proof, that every phase of life demanded a new proof. And what made it so painful wasn't just losing the job, but the familiar feeling, returning the feeling of being doubted, judged, questioned about his ability, as if he had gone back to those early days at West Ham United, where everything he did was viewed through a lens of skepticism. But the story didn't stop there, because when he continued with Everton FC, hope for a fresh start was quickly replaced by the harsh reality of a struggling team, where pressure came not just from expectations of success, but from fear of failure, from the risk of relegation, from an environment where every mistake could lead to serious consequences. And once again, Lampard had to face things he thought he had left behind: doubt, criticism, impatience, and ultimately, once more, departure under circumstances he couldn't control. Once more standing before the question he had asked himself his whole life: am I really good enough? What made this phase special wasn't that Lampard failed. Failure is part of any journey, but the way that failure reflected back everything he had gone through before, like a loop returning to the starting point where he was again the one who had to prove, again the one doubted, again the one with nothing guaranteed except his own effort. But this time it was different, because he was no longer a young player with time ahead, no longer someone who could rely on potential, but someone who had reached the peak, who knew the feeling of success, and now had to face the reality that that success couldn't protect him from new failures. The humiliation, if it could be called that, didn't come from public criticism, but from the inner realization that things weren't as simple as he once thought, that understanding football didn't mean being able to control it from the outside, that the qualities that made him successful as a player didn't automatically translate to success as a coach, and that forced him to confront a version of himself he had never known. Someone uncertain, someone learning again from the beginning, someone who could no longer rely on what he had done to define his current worth. But it was in this second collapse that something began to change. Not the circumstances, not the immediate results, but the way Lampard viewed failure, as he gradually realized that perhaps the problem wasn't that he wasn't enough, but that he had become too accustomed to measuring himself by success, by recognition, by constantly proving, and when those things were gone, he had to learn to exist without them, and to learn to accept that his value wasn't only in what he achieved, but also in how he kept getting back up after everything fell apart. And so Lampard's story in this phase wasn't just a story of failure, but a story of a man forced to return to the starting point, not to repeat what he had done, but to understand himself again, to rebuild from the foundation, to face the questions he had carried his whole life, but this time with no pitch to escape to, no success to shield him, just himself standing between what was lost and what was unknown, trying to find a way to continue, not as a legend, but as a human being. And after all the loops of glory and collapse, of cheers and silence, of standing at the peak and being pulled back to the start, Frank Lampard's story was no longer simply the story of a player or a coach, but the story of two lives existing in parallel within the same person, one the world saw, and one he had quietly endured for more than 20 years that no one truly fully understood. On one side is the icon, the legend of Chelsea FC, the man who scored more than 200 goals, who lifted the most prestigious trophies in Europe, who was praised as one of the greatest midfielders in modern football history, the one millions of fans look to as a model of perfection, of discipline, of a never-give-up spirit, a person whose every run carried meaning, every goal brought joy, every moment was captured as part of history, as proof that effort can turn a player into a legend. But on the other side is a very different person. A person the world rarely sees. Someone who grew up under the pressure of a name he could never escape, who entered professional football not with freedom but with the burden of having to prove, to erase doubts from the moment he had no chance to make mistakes, lived most of his life feeling that everything he had could vanish at any moment if he didn't keep trying harder, working harder, sacrificing more. And it was that person who truly decided how he lived, how he played football, how he saw himself not as someone who had achieved everything, but as someone always on the edge of losing it all. When looking back at the entire journey from the early days at West Ham United, where he was mocked, doubted, labeled a nepo baby, to the years at Chelsea where he built a legendary career, to the moment he lost his mother, the one person who always believed in him unconditionally, to the broken relationships, the non-stop inner battles, to the retirement and the silence, to the failures in his coaching role, it all forms a picture that is not perfect, not smooth, but far more real than any simple success story. It wasn't the journey of someone born with superior talent who easily conquered the world, but the journey of someone who had to fight for every step forward, who had to build every success with effort, discipline, and an almost obsessive persistence. Lampard was never seen as the most naturally gifted player, never the fastest, strongest, or most creative on the pitch. But what made him different wasn't what he was born with. It was how he used what he had, how he never accepted stopping, never believed he was enough, never let doubt, whether from outside or inside, become a reason to quit. He didn't win because he had no weaknesses, but because he didn't allow weaknesses to define him, didn't allow fear to control his actions, even though it was always there, always present, always whispering in his mind that he wasn't good enough. And perhaps what makes Lampard's story so special isn't the titles he won, but the battle he had to fight every day that no one saw. A battle with no audience, no final whistle, no scoreboard to determine winner or loser. A battle between the man he was and his own doubts, fears, pressures he carried from a very young age. And in that battle, victory wasn't how many goals he scored or trophies he lifted, but that he kept getting back up every day, kept stepping onto the pitch, kept facing the world even when inside he might have been falling apart. The legacy Lampard left behind, therefore, isn't just the numbers, isn't just the titles, isn't just the glorious moments, but something deeper, harder to measure, yet more enduring. Discipline not as a habit, but as a way to survive. Willpower not as a slogan, but as something he had to use every day just to not collapse. And resilience not as an innate quality, but as a choice he repeated throughout his life, even when everything became too much to bear. Some become legends because they were born with superior talent. Some because they were lucky to be in the right place at the right time. But Lampard became a legend because he never stopped fighting himself, because he never allowed what he lacked to become a reason he couldn't achieve what he wanted, because he turned doubt into motivation, fear into fuel, pressure into an inseparable part of who he was, even though the price was very high, the voids he had to carry, the cracks that couldn't always be mended. And if there is one thing Lampard's story leaves behind, not just for football fans, but for anyone facing battles others don't see, it is a simple but hard to accept truth that the greatest victory in life isn't defeating others, isn't achieving what the world recognizes, but defeating yourself. Defeating the doubts, the fears, the weaknesses we always try to hide. Because, in the end, it isn't what the world thinks of us that defines who we are, but how we face ourselves when no one is watching. And in Frank Lampard's story, perhaps the most memorable thing isn't the moments he lifted trophies, but the moments he stood alone, facing what was inside, and still chose to continue, still chose not to give up, still chose to keep going even when no one cheered, even when no one knew, because that is truly where a person is defined. Not on the pitch, but in the battle only, they understand. The story of Frank Lampard doesn't just inspire admiration. It leaves a very deep sense of poignancy, because behind the image of a Chelsea FC legend with more than 200 goals and the highest titles is a man who had to live under near inescapable pressure for more than 2 decades, being labeled a Nepo baby from his earliest days at West Ham, then carrying the obsession to prove himself all the way to the peak of his career, shows a very familiar reality in modern society, especially in the United States, where people are often defined by background, achievements, and societal expectations before they have a chance to define themselves. The moment he broke down in tears on the pitch after his mother's death wasn't just an emotional image, but the breaking point of a man who had suppressed too long, and his continuing to play right after reflects a be strong culture many Americans also live in, where emotions are seen as weakness, where people are encouraged to keep pushing forward instead of stopping to heal. His later failures in coaching at Chelsea and Everton further highlight a painful truth. Past success can't protect us from new doubts, just like many Americans after losing a job or changing careers have to face their own worth all over again. However, what makes Lampard truly worthy of admiration isn't that he never fell, but that he always got back up, always kept going, even when there was no longer a pitch to escape to. The biggest lesson from this story for American society is that success isn't a shield against pain, and true strength doesn't lie in hiding emotions, but in daring to face them. Because only when people learn to understand and accept themselves can they truly be free, instead of forever living in a battle no one sees. If the story of Frank Lampard makes you reflect on the silent battles behind the spotlight, please hit subscribe to the channel to join us on the next profound journeys. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the stories the world has never truly seen.